of November 22, 1718, a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard sailed his sloop up the James River in Virginia with something hanging from the bowsprit. It was a human head, decomposing, severed at the neck, swinging gently as the ship moved through the water. The head had been there since the battle at Ocracoke Inlet the previous day. Maynard had cut it off himself and hung it there deliberately, not out of savagery, but out of necessity. He needed proof. He needed every person watching from the riverbanks, every sailor on the warships that fired their cannons in salute as he passed, every merchant and trader and colonial official who had spent the last 2 years living in terror of this man, to see with their own eyes that it was over. The head belonged to Edward Teach, the man the Atlantic world called Blackbeard. In 15 months of active piracy, Blackbeard had blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina, and held a city of thousands hostage. He had commanded a fleet of 4 ships and a crew of more than 300 men. He had captured and plundered more than 40 vessels across the Caribbean and along the eastern coast of North America. He had made a corrupt bargain with a colonial governor and used it as cover to continue pirating from a base on the American mainland. He had terrified an entire generation of sailors into surrender simply by appearing on the horizon. And when Maynard's men finally fought him at Ocracoke, Blackbeard took 5 pistol balls and 20 sword wounds before he fell. 20. 5 gunshots and 20 separate cuts from blades, any one of which should have been enough to stop a man. And still, he kept fighting. His crew watched him absorb that punishment and keep moving, keep swinging, keep killing, until his body finally ran out of blood and he dropped to the deck. When he fell, Maynard cut off his head. The headless body was thrown overboard into the dark water of Pamlico Sound, according to the legend that formed immediately afterward. It swam 3 times around the ship before it sank. Even dead, Blackbeard refused to stay down. This is the story of Edward Teach, the man who understood that in the world of Golden Age piracy, the most powerful weapon was not a cannon or a cutlass. It was terror, and he wielded it better than anyone who ever sailed under a black flag. Nobody knows who Edward Teach actually was. This is not an exaggeration or a rhetorical device. The name Edward Teach itself may not have been his real name. Pirates of the Golden Age routinely used false names to protect their families from the social and legal consequences of being related to a convicted pirate. The historical record contains multiple spellings of the name Teach, Thatch, Thack, Tack, each of them appearing in different documents written by people who actually encountered him or documented his activities. Historian Colin Woodard, who has studied the available sources most carefully, argues that he was more likely called Thatch than Teach, and that the Teach spelling originated in an error by a newspaper reporter. His birth date is unknown. Most historians estimate he was born around 1680, which would have made him approximately 37 or 38 years old at his death. His birthplace is similarly uncertain. Bristol, England appears most often in the historical sources, and Bristol was a major maritime city with deep connections to the Atlantic trade routes that would define Blackbeard's career. But some contemporaries connected him to Jamaica or to London. His family is unknown. His education is unknown. His early career at sea is largely unknown, though there is reasonable evidence that he served as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession, which ran from 1701 to 1713. Privateers were legally authorized pirates. men who operated with a government commission to attack enemy shipping during wartime. The distinction between a privateer and a pirate was essentially the piece of paper authorizing the violence. When the war ended and the commissions expired, thousands of men who had spent years doing exactly what Blackbeard would later do professionally found themselves without legitimate employment and without the ability to stop doing the only thing they knew how to do. Blackbeard was almost certainly among them. What is documented is that around 1716, Edward Teach appeared in Nassau in the Bahamas and joined the crew of a pirate named Benjamin Hornigold. This is where the historical record begins to contain actual names and dates and events that can be verified against multiple sources. And this is where the story of Blackbeard, the character rather than the unknown man, begins to take shape. Benjamin Hornigold was one of the founding figures of what historians call the Pirates' Republic of Nassau. He had been operating out of the Bahamas since approximately 1713, taking prizes in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast, and he had built a reputation as a capable captain who treated his crew fairly and ran an effective operation. He was, by the standards of his profession, something close to a moderating influence. He recognized talent when he saw it. Hornigold gave Teach his own command, a small sloop, and the two operated together for a period, capturing merchant vessels and building the kind of track record that attracted other pirates to their banner. By 1717, when the two of them were operating in the waters around the American colonies in the Caribbean, they had assembled a fleet of multiple vessels and a combined crew that gave them significant fighting power. And then, Hornigold made a decision that Blackbeard could not have predicted. He accepted the royal pardon. In September 1717, King George I issued a proclamation offering amnesty to all pirates who surrendered and pledged to give up the trade by September 5, 1718. Hornigold, who was getting older and may have been growing tired of the constant danger and the constant movement, decided that this was the moment to exit. He took the pardon, went legitimate, and eventually became a pirate hunter himself, one of the men paid by the colonial authorities to track down the men he had once sailed alongside. Edward Teach did not take the pardon. Not yet. Not at this point. He had other plans. He was about to do something that would transform him from a capable pirate captain into a legend. In late 1717, Edward Teach encountered a large French slave ship called La Concorde. La Concorde was a substantial vessel, 320 tons, carrying a crew of 75 men and a cargo of 516 enslaved Africans who had been taken from the coast of West Africa and were being transported to the French colonies in the Caribbean. She was armed, but not heavily enough for what was coming. Teach attacked and captured her. He then did what genuinely talented pirates did when they found the right vessel. He kept it. He renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a name that was itself a political statement, a reference to the previous queen under whose wartime authorization men like him had first learned their trade. He armed her heavily, installing 40 cannons along her gun decks. He recruited a crew of more than 300 men. He transformed a slave ship, a vessel whose entire purpose had been the violent transportation of human beings for profit, into a floating weapons platform that would become the most feared ship in the Atlantic. The Queen Anne's Revenge was not the largest pirate ship that ever sailed. She was not the most heavily armed, but she was captained by a man who understood something that most of his contemporaries did not fully grasp. The ship was a stage. Everything that Blackbeard did on and around the Queen Anne's Revenge was designed to be seen, to be talked about, to travel ahead of him through the maritime world. so that when his ship appeared on the horizon, the men watching it did not see a vessel they could evaluate rationally and decide whether to fight or flee. They saw something that bypassed rational evaluation entirely and reached straight into the oldest, most primitive parts of the human brain. They saw a monster. The beard itself was central to this strategy. Edward Teach grew his black beard to an extraordinary length, then styled it in a way that had never been seen before. He twisted it into numerous small braids or tails, each tied with a colored ribbon, and he arranged these braids so that they spread across his face and chest in an aggressive, wild frame that made him look like nothing in nature. In battle, he would tuck slow-burning fuses made from hemp cord soaked in saltpeter and lime water into the braids and light them. The fuses burned slowly, producing a dense, acrid smoke that wreathed his face in a dark haze. Now picture what the crew of a merchant vessel saw when the Queen Anne's Revenge came alongside. A vast black hull, cannons, a crew of 300 screaming men, and at the bow, this figure, enormous, dark, his face disappearing into a great black beard from which smoke curled in thick ropes, his eyes gleaming through the haze, his hands full of weapons, the sound of his voice carrying across the water above the noise of the sea and the guns. It was theater. Calculated, deliberate, brilliantly executed theater. And it worked almost every time. Most ships that Blackbeard approached simply surrendered. The captain calculated the odds, looked at what was bearing down on him, thought about his crew and his cargo and his own survival, and struck his colors. This was exactly what Blackbeard wanted. A surrender was better than a fight in almost every practical sense. Fights cost lives, your own crew's lives, which meant less manpower and less capacity for future operations. Fights damaged ships. Fights took time and created noise and drew attention. A ship that surrendered without fighting gave you everything you wanted and cost you nothing. Blackbeard's appearance was an investment in peaceful captures. The more terrifying he looked, the fewer fights he needed to have, and the more ships he could take. The fuses in the beard were not vanity, they were efficiency. But the image worked only if it was backed by reality. Blackbeard understood this too. He could not be the monster that his appearance promised if he backed down when resistance was offered. When someone decided not to surrender, when someone decided to fight, Blackbeard had to deliver on the implicit contract of that image. He always delivered. The escalation of Blackbeard's career through 1717 and into 1718 was rapid and remarkable. He added ships to his fleet. He recruited men with a combination of genuine appeals, better pay, more democratic conditions, more opportunity for advancement, and the simple, magnetic pull of his personality, which everyone who encountered him described as extraordinary. He was physically imposing, well over 6 feet tall by the accounts of multiple witnesses, with the kind of physical presence that fills a room and demands attention. He was reportedly intelligent and well-spoken. He could be, when he chose to be, charming and even generous. He chose differently when the situation called for it. There are accounts from this period of his career that illustrate the specific quality of cruelty that Blackbeard deployed strategically. One of the most frequently cited involved a woman, the wife of a captured merchant captain. Blackbeard had the captain and his crew detained while he evaluated the ship's cargo. When he was done, instead of releasing the captain with his crew as he sometimes did, he took the captain's wife aboard his own ship and kept her there for several days before returning her. No specific account of what occurred during those days was recorded. The captain and crew were released afterward, shaken and silent. The silence was the point. Blackbeard did not need to advertise what he was capable of. He needed people to imagine it. And when they imagined it, they would imagine the worst. Because human beings, when given an ambiguous and frightening situation, always imagine the worst. The silence of the merchant captain who had watched his wife taken aboard a pirate ship told every other merchant captain who heard the story exactly what they needed to hear. Do not resist. Do not provoke. Give Blackbeard what he wants, and pray that what he wants is only your cargo. Another account describes Blackbeard hosting a drinking session in his cabin with several members of his crew. He blew out the lanterns, plunging the cabin into total darkness, and then fired his pistols into the darkness, wounding one of his own men in the leg. When asked why, he reportedly said that if he did not kill one of his men now and then, they would forget who he was. This story appears in Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, which is the primary source for most accounts of Golden Age piracy, and which historians treat with a combination of respect and caution. Johnson, who may or may not have been the novelist Daniel Defoe, writing under a pseudonym, had access to court records, newspaper accounts, and testimony from people who had actually encountered the pirates he described. But he also had a readership that wanted entertainment as much as history, and some of his more colorful anecdotes may reflect what people believed about Blackbeard rather than what actually happened. What is certain is that by 1718, Blackbeard's reputation had reached a level where the distinction between documented fact and embellished legend had ceased to matter in practical terms. The terror was real, regardless of which specific stories were accurate. The surrender of merchant ships was real. The paralysis of the colonial trading economy was real. And then he did the most audacious thing he had done yet. He blockaded an entire city. In mid-May 1718, Blackbeard sailed his 4-ship fleet into the approaches to Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Charleston, in 1718, was one of the most important ports on the American eastern seaboard. It was the economic center of the Carolina colonies, a wealthy city built on the trade in rice, indigo, and other colonial products. Ships moved through its harbor constantly, carrying exports to Britain and Europe and imports back to the colonies. It was also, importantly, a city under British colonial authority, which meant that what Blackbeard was about to do was not just piracy. It was an act of open defiance against the British Crown, conducted on the doorstep of a colonial capital. He stopped every ship entering or leaving Charleston Harbor for an entire week. Every ship that tried to leave was captured. Every ship that tried to enter was captured. The harbor was sealed. The city was cut off from the sea. In an era when virtually all significant commerce moved by water, this was an economic catastrophe in real time. Blackbeard took multiple prisoners from the ships he captured. His most prominent hostage was a man named Samuel Wragg, a member of the Governor's Council of South Carolina, which made him one of the most powerful officials in the colony. Blackbeard held Wragg and several other hostages and sent a message to the Governor of South Carolina, Robert Johnson. The message was specific. Blackbeard wanted a chest of medicine, medical supplies, not gold, not silver, not the most valuable cargo in any of the ships he was holding. He wanted medicine. The reasons for this specific demand have been debated by historians. The most practical explanation is that his crew, which had been at sea for an extended period, had developed serious health problems, possibly including syphilis or other sexually transmitted infections, and that the medical supplies he was requesting were treatments for those conditions. Whatever the reason, The demand was clear: produce the chest of medicine, or the hostages would be killed. Governor Johnson had no real choice. Refusing meant the deaths of Samuel Wragg and the other hostages, which would have been a political disaster on top of the economic disaster that was already unfolding. He produced the medicine. Blackbeard released the hostages, stripped most of their clothing and valuables before releasing them as a final act of humiliation, and sailed away. He had blockaded a major colonial city for a week. He had taken a member of the governor's council hostage. He had extorted the colonial government of South Carolina. He had done all of it in broad daylight, in the most visible shipping lane on the American eastern seaboard, and he had sailed away with everything he demanded. The Gazette in South Carolina described it as striking a great terror to the whole province. That was, of course, exactly what Blackbeard intended. 2 weeks after leaving Charleston, Blackbeard made a decision that changed the trajectory of his career. He ran 2 of his ships aground at Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina. Whether this was an accident or a deliberate act is one of the genuinely contested questions in the historical record of his life. The most intriguing theory, supported by some circumstantial evidence, is that Blackbeard ran the ships aground deliberately to reduce the size of his fleet and, more importantly, to reduce the number of men who would share in the plunder he had accumulated. By beaching the Queen Anne's Revenge and another vessel, he effectively marooned a large portion of his crew and kept the treasure among a smaller, more manageable group of his most trusted men. This theory, if true, reveals a calculating coldness that complicates the romantic image of the great pirate captain who led his men through danger and shared the rewards equally. It suggests that Blackbeard's loyalty to his crew had specific limits, that when the arithmetic of profit versus obligation became sufficiently extreme, he was willing to strand the men who had trusted him. The historical record cannot confirm this with certainty. What is confirmed is that 2 ships grounded at Beaufort Inlet, that a significant number of crew members were left behind, and that Blackbeard sailed away with a smaller crew, a smaller ship, and whatever treasure had survived the grounding toward the coast of North Carolina. He was heading for Bath, North Carolina, and a meeting with Governor Charles Eden. The governor of North Carolina was corrupt. This is not a harsh, retrospective judgment. It is what the historical record documents. Charles Eden accepted Blackbeard's application for a royal pardon in June 1718, which was legal and within his authority. He performed a ceremony in which Blackbeard was formally married to a local woman, reportedly his 14th wife, though this number strains credulity and may reflect embellishment. And then, he apparently made a private arrangement with Blackbeard that allowed the pirate to continue operating under the cover of legitimacy. Eden's secretary, Tobias Knight, was the collector of customs for North Carolina. When Blackbeard resumed pirating shortly after taking the pardon, the plunder was laundered through a complicated process involving false legal claims that the captured ships were legitimate prizes taken from Spain. Knight received a share. Eden received a share. Blackbeard was effectively paying protection money to the colonial government of North Carolina in exchange for the freedom to continue being Blackbeard. This arrangement lasted several months. During that time, Blackbeard used Ocracoke Island, a remote spit of land on the outer banks of North Carolina, accessible through shallow inlets that warships could not easily navigate, as his base of operations. He raided ships in Pamlico Sound. He hosted gatherings at Ocracoke that reportedly drew other pirates from throughout the Atlantic coast, including a famous meeting with the pirate Charles Vane, at which the assembled crews celebrated with drinking and music, and all the activities that men who lived dangerous lives engaged in when they had a moment of relative safety. But the arrangement with Eden had enemies. The merchants and traders of Virginia, whose shipping was being disrupted by the continuing piracy, were furious. They had no confidence that the governor of North Carolina would deal with the problem, and they were right to have none. They turned to Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, who had both the will and the means to act. Spotswood hated pirates. He had been vocal about the need to destroy Caribbean and Atlantic piracy, and the presence of Blackbeard operating openly under the protection of a neighboring governor was a direct challenge to everything he believed about the proper administration of the colonies. He could not legally operate his authority within North Carolina, but he could prepare a naval expedition and send it south. In October 1718, Spotswood planned the operation that would end Blackbeard's career. He organized 2 small naval sloops, the Ranger and the Jane, and placed them under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard. Maynard was given specific orders: go to Ocracoke, find Blackbeard, and kill him. The shallow waters around Ocracoke required shallow draft vessels, which was why Maynard's ships were small sloops rather than frigates. Maynard's force consisted of approximately 57 men. He was going after a man who had survived multiple naval engagements, who had a fleet and a crew, and the home field advantage of waters he knew intimately, and his pursuers had never seen. Spotswood offered a reward for Blackbeard, dead or alive: £100 for the captain himself, various smaller amounts for each of his officers and crew. Maynard set out in November 1718. On the night of November 21st, 1718, Maynard's 2 sloops arrived at Ocracoke and anchored out of sight of the pirate camp. He had made the approach quietly, using local pilots who knew the channels, and the element of surprise was at least partially preserved. Blackbeard was on his sloop, the Adventure, with a crew of approximately 25 men. He had been informed, by some accounts, that naval vessels were in the area. He had been carousing with his crew through the evening. When dawn approached and Maynard's ships began their advance through the narrow channels, Blackbeard was ready for them, or as ready as a man who had been drinking through the night could be. He ordered the anchor cable cut, turning the Adventure to meet the attack. Maynard's 2 ships ran aground almost immediately in the shallow water. Blackbeard ordered his gunners to fire a broadside at the stranded vessels. The broadside killed the commander of the Ranger and wounded or killed a significant number of the crew of both ships. In a single volley, Maynard had lost a substantial portion of his fighting force. Maynard ordered the surviving crew of the Jane below deck. From Blackbeard's perspective, looking at the 2 ships after the broadside, one of them appeared to have almost no crew visible. He made a calculation that would prove to be his last mistake. He brought the Adventure alongside the Jane and ordered his men to board her, certain that the fight was essentially over. Maynard's crew came up from below. What followed was one of the most famous hand-to-hand naval engagements in the history of the Golden Age of Piracy. Blackbeard's 25 men swarming onto a deck that was suddenly full of Maynard's sailors, pistols fired at point-blank range, cutlasses swinging in a space so confined that there was almost no room to maneuver. Blackbeard himself in the center of it all. Accounts describe him fighting through the chaos with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. He took a bullet and kept going. He took another and kept going. He cut down men around him, engaging Maynard directly in a hand-to-hand fight that lasted long enough for Maynard's account of it to be specific and detailed. One of Maynard's sailors came behind Blackbeard and cut him across the neck with a sword. Blackbeard turned on the man who had cut him, spraying blood. He took another bullet. He reloaded one of his pistols. The accounts say he had 6 pistols loaded and ready, carried in a bandolier across his chest. He raised the loaded pistol to fire it, and he fell. He fell dead, according to Maynard's own account, with 5 pistol shots in him and 20 dismal cuts in several parts of his body. 5 shots, 20 cuts, 25 separate wounds that had to accumulate, one after another, before the body of Edward Teach finally accepted what was happening and stopped. The battle was over. Maynard's men secured the survivors of Blackbeard's crew. Maynard walked to the body of the man he had come to kill and drew his blade. He cut off the head. He hung it from the bowsprit of the Jane, and then he sailed north to Virginia to deliver the proof that the most feared pirate in the Atlantic was dead. The days after the Battle of Ocracoke produced an immediate legal reckoning for the men who had sailed with Blackbeard. The surviving members of his crew, 15 men, were transported to Williamsburg, Virginia, where they were tried before the general court. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. All 15 were convicted of piracy. 13 of them were hanged. The executions were conducted publicly, as was standard practice, and the bodies were displayed afterward as a warning. The message was the same one Maynard had been sending since he hung the head from the bowsprit. It is over. It was always going to end this way. This is what piracy costs. But the aftermath of Blackbeard's death had a more complicated dimension that the simple narrative of justice served cannot fully capture. Governor Spotswood of Virginia, who had organized and funded the expedition against Blackbeard, found himself in a legal dispute over the rewards. The financial arrangements for paying the men who had killed Blackbeard and captured his crew were complicated by jurisdictional questions, since Ocracoke was in North Carolina's territory, and Spotswood had operated across that boundary without legal authority. Maynard and his men had to fight for their payment. Governor Eden of North Carolina, the corrupt official who had made his private arrangement with Blackbeard, was formally investigated. His secretary Tobias Knight, who had received stolen goods through the piracy laundering scheme, died before he could be fully prosecuted. Eden survived the investigation and remained governor until his death in 1722, never formally held accountable for what the historical record strongly suggests he did. The Queen Anne's Revenge, the flagship that had made Blackbeard famous, remained on the ocean floor where it had grounded at Beaufort Inlet. In 1996, underwater archaeologists located a wreck that matched its description and position. The site has been excavated extensively in the years since, and more than 400,000 artifacts have been recovered, including cannons, weapons, navigational instruments, and the personal belongings of the men who had sailed on her. The wreck cannot be confirmed as the Queen Anne's Revenge with absolute documentary certainty, but the evidence is considered compelling by the maritime archaeologists who have studied it. As for Blackbeard's head, the one that Maynard hung from the bowsprit and brought to Virginia as proof of death, it was eventually placed on a pole at the mouth of the Hampton River in Virginia. The site has been known as Blackbeard's Point ever since. The skull eventually disappeared from the historical record, though a skull that some claimed was Blackbeard's appeared in various collections in subsequent centuries. None of these claims has been verified. He left behind his head as a monument, and even that the world managed to lose. What was the actual scale of Blackbeard's career? This question requires some careful accounting, because the popular image of Blackbeard as the supreme pirate of the Golden Age does not always survive contact with the comparative record. In approximately 15 months of active piracy, from late 1716 to November 1718, Blackbeard captured approximately 40 to 50 vessels. He commanded, at the height of his power, 4 ships and a crew of more than 300 men. He operated in the Caribbean and along the American eastern seaboard from the Bahamas to Virginia. He blockaded Charleston, the most audacious single pirate operation on the American coast in the Golden Age. He maintained a corrupt arrangement with a colonial government that allowed him to operate openly on the American mainland for months. By any objective measure, this is an impressive record. 40 ships, 300 men, the blockade of a colonial capital. But compare it to Bartholomew Roberts, who was operating at almost exactly the same period, and who captured more than 400 ships in 3 years. Roberts was more successful by any numerical measure. Roberts operated over a wider geographic range. Roberts's impact on Atlantic trade was larger and longer lasting. Roberts is far less famous than Blackbeard. This disparity in fame tells you something important about how history works, and specifically about the specific quality that made Blackbeard genuinely unique in the history of Golden Age piracy. Roberts was more successful, but Blackbeard was more terrifying. And terrifying is what history remembers. Blackbeard understood, with an instinct that bordered on genius, that in the specific context of maritime piracy in the early 18th century, fear was a more powerful force than force itself. The Atlantic Ocean was too large to police. Ships were too numerous to protect individually. The Royal Navy was stretched across multiple theaters of war and colonial obligation. In this environment, a pirate who could make every ship in his operating area afraid to resist him was more effective than a pirate who had to actually fight for each capture. Blackbeard never had to fight for most of his captures. The appearance of the Queen Anne's Revenge on the horizon, with its 40 guns and its black flag, and the smoke rising from the braids of its captain's beard, was enough. Most ships surrendered before a shot was fired. The economics of Blackbeard's piracy were based almost entirely on the investment he had made in his own image. This is why the fuses in the beard matter so much as a historical detail. They were not useful in any conventional military sense. A burning fuse does not deflect a sword cut or stop a pistol ball. But they transformed Blackbeard's face into something that no one who saw it would ever be able to describe in ordinary terms. They made him look like a man who was already on fire, who was already burning, who had gone so far past the normal boundaries of human behavior that the physical laws governing other men had simply ceased to apply to him. When men who had seen that face told their stories in port taverns afterward, other men listened with the particular attention that people give to descriptions of genuine nightmare. And those men, the ones who had only heard the story, carried the image in their heads, so that when they were at sea and saw a large ship bearing down on them with black flags flying, the image they already carried came flooding back. The burning beard, the smoke, the voice screaming across the water, the pistols. They struck their colors and surrendered. They had never even met Blackbeard. They surrendered to the story. That is the specific genius of what Edward Teach built in 15 months of piracy. He built a story so powerful that it worked even when he was not there, because the version of him that lived in other people's imaginations was more terrifying than anything the real man could be. The question of who Edward Teach actually was, beneath the theater and the image and the carefully constructed monster, is one that the historical record cannot fully answer, but is worth asking. The drinking session in which he shot one of his own men in the dark, so they would not forget who he was, suggests a man who was aware of the performance at all times, who understood that the terror had to be constantly refreshed and renewed, that men who grew too comfortable with their captain would stop fearing him, and a pirate captain who was not feared was a pirate captain who would not last long. The decision to corrupt Governor Eden, to build a political cover for his operations, suggests a man who thought strategically beyond the immediate tactical level. Most pirates of the Golden Age lived entirely in the present, taking what they could, spending it as fast as they got it, making no long-term plans. Blackbeard made long-term plans. The Charleston blockade, the most dramatic single operation of his career, was not just piracy. It was a demonstration of what he was capable of, conducted in the most visible possible location, against the most prominent possible target. It was advertising. It was a message sent to every merchant and every governor and every naval officer in the Atlantic world. I can do this anywhere. I can do this to you. The 14 wives that legend assigns to him, even if the number is an exaggeration, reflect something about how he moved through the world. He was physically imposing, reportedly charming when he chose to be, and surrounded by the specific dangerous glamour that extreme risk and violence seem to generate in certain people's perceptions. He was, in the context of his time and place, genuinely famous. People wanted to be around him. People wanted to be part of his story. This attraction to him, this gravitational pull of the famous and the dangerous, was itself a resource. Men joined his crew in part because they wanted to be close to whatever Blackbeard was. The reputation that frightened his enemies drew his allies in. He used everything. He used his body. He used his beard. He used smoke and noise and the specific acoustic properties of his own voice calling across open water. He used fear, and he used charm, and he used violence when he needed to, and the threat of violence when he did not. He used corruption and negotiation and the specific weakness of men who valued their own comfort above their public responsibilities. He used the legal system when it served him, and defied it when it did not. He was, in the analysis of the historians who have studied him most carefully, genuinely intelligent. Not educated in the formal sense. Not a navigator with the mathematical precision of Bartholomew Roberts, but intelligent in the specific way that the most effective leaders of dangerous men are intelligent. He understood people. He understood what they feared and what they wanted. He understood how to put himself at the center of other people's imaginations and stay there. The 15 months of his pirate career ended with 25 wounds on his body and a lieutenant's sword at his neck. But they also produced a legend that has lasted 300 years and shows no signs of diminishing. The legacy of Blackbeard is one of the most durable and pervasive in the entire culture of the Atlantic world. His image appears everywhere. He is the default mental picture that most people in most of the English-speaking world carry when they hear the word pirate. His black flag, the skull with the hourglass and the bleeding heart, the symbols that told the approaching ship that time was running out, is recognized as an iconic design 3 centuries after the man who flew it was beheaded on the deck of a sloop in a North Carolina inlet. The Queen Anne's revenge is being recovered, artifact by artifact, from the ocean floor where he grounded her in 1718. 400,000 objects and more, the physical debris of a famous career, each piece telling a small part of the story of who these men were and how they lived. Ocracoke Island, the remote North Carolina Outer Bank where Blackbeard made his last stand, remains a place of pilgrimage for people drawn to his story. The local legend holds that on clear nights you can see a light moving through the dark water of Pamlico Sound. Locals call it the Teach Light. They say it is the headless body of Blackbeard, still swimming through the water where Maynard threw it, still searching for the head that Maynard took away. This is the kind of afterlife that only a very particular kind of person generates. Not a saint's afterlife, or a hero's afterlife, a monster's afterlife. The continued existence in the cultural imagination of something that the rational mind knows is dead, but that refuses to feel dead, that keeps surfacing in the dark water of the imagination and won't sink, no matter how many times you try to push it down. The story of Blackbeard is, in the end, the story of what happens when a person of genuine intelligence and genuine ambition decides to invest everything they have in a single, specific effect. He wanted to terrify people. He designed everything about himself, his appearance, his behavior, his reputation, his flag, his voice, his choices, to produce and sustain that terror. And he succeeded so completely that 300 years after his death, the image he built is still the first thing that comes to mind when the word pirate is spoken. He won in the specific way that he was trying to win. He did not accumulate lasting wealth. He did not build an empire. He did not live to old age. He died at sea, as sailors die, quickly and violently, his body thrown into shallow water by men who needed to be certain he was gone. But the head went to Virginia on the bowsprit of a sloop, hung there for every eye to see, and the sight of it did not end the story. It became the story. It became Blackbeard's most lasting contribution to the world he had terrorized. The proof that the monster was real, that the terror had a source, that the burning beard and the screaming voice and the 6 pistols had belonged to an actual human being who had walked on actual ships and breathed actual air, and whose blood was now drying in the North Carolina sun. He had been real. That was the thing that made him permanent. The monster had been real, and the monsters that are real are the ones that stay with you. The headless body swam 3 times around the ship, and then it sank, and the story started. They have not stopped.